our second session for today. What is an Islamic approach to knowledge, understanding the pursuit of ilm? My name is Iman Masmoudi. I'm a master's student here at the university, and I have the honor to introduce Sidi Hasan Spiker today. Sidi Hasan Spiker spent 12 years studying the Islamic intellectual sciences in the Middle East, where he focused on interactions between the school of Ibn Arabi and late Kalam theology, and also completed his memorization of the Quran, mashallah. Hasan holds a BA in philosophy from the University of London and is currently studying for his MPhil at the University of Cambridge. A researcher at Tabah Foundation, he's the author of several philosophical studies and academic articles, including the mystical synthesis of Ibn Baha'u'ddin, an Akbarian Kalam theologian in the 16th century Istanbul, and Things as They Are, Nafs al-Amr, and the Ontological Foundations of Objective Truth. So we'll hear from Sidi Hasan for a time, and then there will be a period for questions at the end, so please keep that in mind. We also want to encourage you all to see the day as a sequence that is interconnected, so please feel free to compare this session to the previous session and to create cumulative learnings, inshallah. So without further ado, please welcome Sidi Hasan.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى سيد الله وبارك تنحل بها وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل وسلم بأنواع كمالاتك في جميع تجلياتك على سيدنا مولانا محمد الأول الأنوار الصادقة من بحور عظمة ذات المحققة في عالمين مع الأسماء والصفات فهو أول حامد ومتعدد بأنواع العبادات والقربات والممد في عالم الأرواح والأشباح لجميع الموجودات وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة تكشف لنا النقاب عن وجه الكريم والمرائي واليقظات تعرفنا بك به في جميع المرات والحضارات وطرقنا يا مولانا بجاهد الحركات والسكنات والأحضار والحضارات وطرقنا يا مولانا بجاهد الحركات والسكنات والأحضار وطرقنا يا مولانا بجاهد الحركات والسكنات والأحضار والحضارات سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Man is the meeting place of the angelic and the animal realms. This understanding of the nature of man is in fact very, very standard throughout Islamic history, but I've described it to Shah Waliullah, the great 18th century Indian philosopher and theologian mystic, because he provides such a beautiful exposition of the meaning of this term and its entailments in all sorts of different realms in one of his great works, Hajjatullah al-Balagha. If man is the meeting place between the angelic and the animal realms, then he very uniquely, spanning all of creation in his being, is capable of being the vicegerent of the world, being the caretaker, the custodian of the world in all of its dimensions, and taking care of the cultivation and the protection of the world. And man by nature desires to know, as Aristotle said, but of course what we subsequently know depends very much upon what our vision of human nature is. And if we are a meeting place of the angelic and the animal, then our knowledge and our faculties of knowledge must also constitute windows onto those very different worlds. This is a quote from Toshkoplazada, a very, very important late Ottoman philosopher and theologian, in a very standard digest of the sciences. is to give an idea very early on of the way in which the synthesis of the different faculties, which Sidi Ahmed alluded to, were very standardly understood to not lie in any form of contradiction. The way of deductive inference, so that's the rational, very standard rational, every A is B, every B is C, every A is C, very kind of linear, ordinary reasoning. The way of deductive inference and the way of Gnostic witnessing, both of the two ways sometimes become resolved into the other, such that the person in possession of them both becomes a meeting place of the two seas, Majma' al-Bahrain. That is, the two seas of deductive inference and Gnostic witnessing, or knowledge and gnosis, or the observed world and the unseen world. Knowledge pertaining to essences and nafs al-amr, he goes on, can equally be acquired via speculative investigation, nadhar, or via spiritual purification, tasfiyah. Remember, this is not an esoteric text, this is a standard digest about the ulum. Only the aged, as-shuyukh, or slow-witted, al-aghbiya, which is a very nice way of translating aghbiya, should suffice themselves with spiritual purification alone, solely due to their inability to learn the way of speculative investigation, another. And so we see hints here of a scheme that was understood in the Ottoman world and in the Mughal world, and in general in the developed Islamic sciences, of the sources of knowledge. There are three faculties, but there are four sources. So, as Sidi Ahmed beautifully laid out in his talk, fundamentally, the purpose or the incentive to know and to seek knowledge is to respond to this extraordinary event of the revelation, which fills people with light and fills people with insight and fills people with knowledge that clearly by its own nature announced that it came from another world. So we have, as an entailment of man's nature, mystical cognition, which is akin to the angels, reason, which is in a way man's own isthmus and barzakh between different modes of knowing, and sense experience, of course, which belongs to the animal dimension. And you can see this lovely kite-shaped scheme of knowledge where you have revelation, mystical cognition, sense experience and reason. And you can see, with my very limited artistic capabilities, that each arrow is, they're both going in both directions here. So sense experience feeds into reason. It's only because of a world of sense experience on some accounts that we're able to abstract the universals which constitute the objects of our rational mind. And reason, on the other hand, is that which renders the sensible world intelligible in the first place. The empirical world in itself, being distinct is not part of being empirical. Why is the world distinct? Why does it present itself as distinct? It's not because of the senses. It's not because of an empirical element. It's because of the intellect, either on a very modern view, imposing itself on the world, or because the nature is fundamentally infused with rational principles. And we have the same situation with revelation. If you wanted to prove that revelation is true, you wouldn't cite a verse from the Quran to someone who doesn't believe, of course. And even when we come to believe in the revelation, there is certainly an experiential aspect, but there's definitely always a rational aspect as well. It's very difficult to believe in something which is rationally unacceptable. And then the revelation also supports reason, because there are many things beyond the ken of reason. Exactly what happens to us after we die, for example. Where exactly do we go? What are those abodes? Not something that even any philosophers that I know of would claim is knowable directly by reason. There are many who would prove the existence of an afterlife, but not the exact what of it. So we have this experience. Of course, we have revelation and sense experience in a symbiosis. سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. So the signs are seen, they're manifest in nature. Nature is infused with this symbolic quality. And then we have the relationship between reason and mystical cognition. I won't go into every relationship, but we can kind of extrapolate from there. The relationship of reason and mystical cognition is very important because it was often thought on a certain narrative of Islamic intellectual history that it was always an either-or. It was always making a choice to either follow the path of rationalism or to be a full esotericist. But of course, history tells us otherwise. And one very, very important distinction which was made in the developing Islamic sciences is that between the discursive intellect and the receptive intellect. So the discursive intellect is what Shaykh al-Akbar calls al-aql min haythu huwa mutafakkir, and the receptive intellect is al-aql min haythu huwa qabil. So very often rationalists don't understand that there is a point at which reason can go no further. It doesn't have enough material to work on anymore. But on the other hand, esotericists, if you want to call them that, don't understand that reason still does have a place. And if you broaden your understanding of the intellect, then there's a possibility of entirely fusing the two. The intellect, in the sense of ordinary rational investigation, is seen as the kind of outward tip of a single fusion of intelligibility. And in keeping with this, to help us to see just how integrated this was into the later system, this is in Sharh al-Mawaqif by Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani, the most important work in Ilm al-Kalam of the last 600 years, without a single doubt, hundreds of super commentaries. But Jurjani, although a very, bewilderingly proficient in logic and metaphysics, but he's from the school of Ibn Arabi. And he tells us here that the spiritual exercises of those who deny the truth of Islam amongst the Jews and Christians lead them to false creedal beliefs. It is necessary thus that spiritual exercises be accompanied by rational investigation. So this idea that reason is just logic chopping, and it's kind of embarrassing that the modern world would continue to rely on that kind of silly syllogistic mode of thought, when of course everything is really direct experience. And the truth is, the monks on Mount Athos and Santa Teresa of Avila and many mystics believe that their experiences confirm their creed. So there's a great danger there. A spiritual experience can be a proof for the individual, but it can't be a proof for the society or for a proof for an institution, because it's private. And let's look now at the way in which, get out of the purely theoretical and see how this was manifest in an actual civilization. There's no greater figure, perhaps, as a patron of the implementation of this scheme than the great Sultan Muhammad II. And there's a famous story of scholars in the Fanari family who, there's one of the Fanari scholars telling one of his sons that he was with the Sultan. He said, أن السلطان قال لي يوما أن الباحثين عن علوم الحقيقة المتكلمون والصوفية والحكماء. The Sultan said to me one day, those who seek after the sciences of the truth are the Kalam theologians, the Sufis, and the philosophers. ولا بد من المحاكمة بين هؤلاء الطوائف. And we must adjudicate between these different groups. قال والدي قلت للسلطان محمد خان لا يقدر على المحاكمة بين هؤلاء إلا المولى عبد الرحمن الجامي. And I said to the Sultan, no one can carry out this adjudication between those groups, too difficult, other than Abdurrahman Jami, the famous Persian poet, known ordinarily as the last of the great classical Persian poets, but of course an Akbarian metaphysician of the first order, and a great scholar of many of the sciences. قال فأرسل السلطان محمد خان إليه رسولا مع جوائز السنية والتمس منه المحاكمة المذكورة فكتب رسالة حاكم فيها بين هؤلاء الطوائف. So Sultan Muhammad Khan sent him a messenger with beautiful gifts and beseeched him to carry out this said adjudication. And so Abdurrahman Jami duly wrote this now very famous book, Al-Durr al-Fatila, which carried out this adjudication. Now, the extraordinary thing about this adjudication is that this was an imperial request, and Abdurrahman Jami, if you read the book, you'll find that he favors the Sufis on every single question. So it's a very interesting adjudication. And that was obviously not deemed a problem in the Ottoman establishment. And we can see that from face value as we're reading the text. Of course, there's mountains of evidence that Akbarian thought this synthetical attitude was closely intertwined with the Ottoman establishment from the very beginning, from the moment that Delft al-Qaysari was installed as the first head of the first ever Ottoman madrasa, and he was in a line of two sheikhs away from Ibn Arabi himself. So this somewhat unfamiliar picture comes out of this beautiful insight, which I must ascribe to my mentor, Ahmed Keeler, of the distinction between, in this, what is now very much discredited account, of two broad ages. I've exaggerated a bit by calling it an actual dark age. I'm not sure if that's obviously very common, but this is the clear implication, which is that the Great Golden Age, which runs from about 800 to 1258, that captures the Western imagination so much and is usually populated by these scientific figures. Look, we had optics too, we had physics too, we had the mathematics, and us too. We're also great contributors to this incontestably wonderful modern world. And then you have the Dark Age, where there's about 5 philosophers who managed to pop into existence despite the kind of enormously inhospitable environment of mysticism and legalism and so on. But one is Al-Ghazali, who's interesting because he has a skeptical stage and comes through it to certainty. And Ibn Rushd, who's the kind of tragic last philosopher who tries to refute Al-Ghazali's obscurantism, but then sadly fades and only to become the commentator in the West. And then Ibn Khaldun pops into existence another 300 years later. He's another philosopher and found sociology. And Mullah Sadra, who does this extraordinary synthesis, the first person to ever synthesize all of the sources of knowledge. And this is something much closer to the truth. And I, again, owe this first stage to Sidi Ahmed, because this is what the Golden Age really was. It was a stage of formation. So it's the formation of the schools of law, it's the philosophical translations from Greek. Ibn Sina, his extraordinary synthesis, the Ash'ari triumph over Mu'tazilism. Al-Ghazali, I contend, is in the stage of formation, a very important figure at the end, integrating Sufism into the sciences. And then the development of Junaidi Sufis and standardization of the turuq and so on. But then I believe that the period, fairly arbitrarily dated to the death of Imam al-Ghazali, is the period of flowering, which is when the sciences are being developed further and further. Fakhruddin Razi implements the whole of Ibn Sina, which was Kalam formerly being quite anti-philosophical in many ways, and very, very generally, very dialectical rather than truly demonstrative, as Imam al-Ghazali tells us in several of his work. Fakhruddin Razi implementing the whole Avicennian curriculum into Kalam. And then the appearance of Ibn Arabi in the school of Ibn Arabi, Sadruddin al-Qunawi being fully conversant with the works of Ibn Sina, and Athiruddin al-Abhari, Dawud al-Qaysari, who's really probably one of the first to, looks like I just zoomed in by touching the screen, which I didn't know you could do. So, can I zoom out here? Sorry. So, one of the first to carry out this One of the first to carry out the beginnings of this synthesis is Dawud al-Qaysari, again the first head of the first Ottoman madrasa. Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, who's the greatest commentator on Suhrawardi, another great philosophical school, the Shirazi school that appears at this time, who also refers very appreciatively to Ibn Arabi, as we'll, for a reason we'll see later, and many others. And then we have the period of synthesis, and I think the first great figure here is Mullah Fanari, the first Ottoman Sheikh of Islam, who really, without taking anything away from a great thinker, Mullah Sadra, but really most of the innovations ascribed to Mullah Sadra should be ascribed to Mullah Fanari about 150 years earlier. All of the principles of the synthesis of the modes of knowledge are present in his Misbah al-Unus in a very clear fashion. And there are many people in Iran today who, well, there's a huge fervor for Mullah Sadra, but there are many people in Iran today who agree with that and understand that very well, like Hasan Spiker and others. Ibn Kamal, another very important figure in this synthesis. Abdurrahman Jami, Jalal Dawani, Qadi Mir in Iran just before the Safavid invasion. Abdul Hakim Sayyid, who was killed in fact by the Safavid government. Abdul Hakim Sayyid in India. Shah Wali Allah. Let's try and move this down here. Never mind. Abdul Hakim Sayyid Abu Thana al-Alusi in Iraq. Ibrahim Gorani in the Hijaz. Tashqa Prezadi. The list goes on. And this, I'm saying, goes up to 1923. I mean, at the end, right at the end, you have Ibrahim Haki Izmirli, who does the same thing. And the reason for this, the fundamental reason, is because ours was not a world of isolated individuals popping into existence and disagreeing with each other, and then you follow this school or that, or a Cartesian or whatever. These are all schools which are intertwined and come out of one another and constitute a single flowering. There's no rationalism over on this side and mysticism on this side. Look how they all come out of one another. Fakhruddin Razi and Muhyiddin ibn Arabi corresponded, and then the great Maragha school that comes out of Razi's teaching. We have Nasiruddin al-Tulsi, the inveterate Avicennian, who's supposed to, I mean, the common modern narrative of this supposed conflict between Sunnism and Shiism was supposed to be a kind of untouchable figure. His books were core parts of the curriculum, and he corresponded with al-Qunawi, a very rich philosophical correspondence where he's utterly reverential of al-Qunawi. And both of them were the teacher of Qutbuddin al-Shirazi. They were both teachers of Qutbuddin al-Shirazi. And as you can see, everyone is interlinked here. Sadruddin al-Qunawi, Mullah Fanari only has one intermediary between him and Sadruddin al-Qunawi, which is his father. And you can see the interlinking all the way up. Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani, the most important author of later Kalam, perhaps, accompanied Mullah Fanari. They were both Akbarians, but they're both famous for very intense logical works and so on. So, Now there's a thing I want to very briefly cover, which comes out of our work in Tabah Foundation under the direction of one of the great thinkers of our time, Dr. Karim Laham, who has revived the study of first principles and the understanding of the subordination and subordination of the sciences in Islam. Because all of this was possible, this subordination of the animal to the angelic, was only possible if the sciences are also reflecting the order of being and are all in their proper places. So we have metaphysics, which in a way corresponds to the angelic level of cognition, which provides all of the other sciences with their first principles. So there's no sense of the isolated mathematician who knows nothing but mathematics, but is revered as this kind of genius, even though he's just going as deep as, far too deep into quantity alone. He has nothing to say about anything else. That's not even possible in our tradition. To be trained in our tradition meant necessarily to be trained in all of the sciences. And of course, it's human nature that the individual is more attracted to a particular science. And that's in no way a problem. I mean, that's something to be encouraged. But every student in the Ottoman madrasa would have to study Sharh al-Mawaqif. We're talking about a work of bewildering complexity in order to really get his alamiya. So metaphysics provides the first principles. It provides the most basic definitions. And physics and mathematics and the other sciences cannot even proceed without metaphysics providing those first principles. So I won't go in detail into all I'll point out here is the idea that you can see that revelation and metaphysics are both in a way the highest science. And in the later tradition, the entirety of metaphysics is really absorbed into later Kalam theology. And then there's a discussion about, well, does that mean theology just is metaphysics? We don't have to keep on talking about them as distinct areas. Is theology only the highest sciences, so-called religious sciences, or does it embrace all of the other sciences? And there are many people who don't make a distinction, of course, between religious and other sciences. But here we have Abu Thana al-Alusi. The honour of a science is the honour of its subject matter, and the subject of Quranic exegesis is the Word of God. It is thus the master science of religion because it is derived from the book. This does not negate theology, including metaphysics, also being the master science, because Quranic exegesis depends upon it becoming demonstrated that he speaks, just as theology depends upon the book for the establishment and determination of many of its questions. Each of them are thus, in a sense, the master of the other. And we can understand this very clearly, in that it's simply a question of direction. The revelation is coming down to us, and we are going up to the revelation. And so metaphysics is higher science in terms of our movement to the revelation. And the actual revelation is the highest source of knowledge, of course, in Nafs al-Amr, the highest source, but in terms of its descending, being given to us. And so one way in which this subordination of the sciences works, موضوع الطبيعي, the subject matter of natural science, هو الجسم من حيث يتغير, is the body insofar as it's in change. وموضوع الإلهي هو الموجود من حيث الموجود. But the subject matter of metaphysics is the existent thing insofar as it is existent. So something which studies existent things insofar as they are existent, any conclusions which we come to in that science will necessarily apply to all of the lower sciences as well, because that embraces everything. And a body, insofar as it's changing, is obviously an existent. And so all of the ahkam of existence will also apply to it. It's just a more narrow determination of existence. So how did this work? I'm trying to give you an idea of the complexity and the sophistication in a way here, but I was told by their organizers to try to keep things to the barest essentials. And in all honesty, I couldn't bring it down to any barer essentials than this. What I hope is that if any of this interests you, that you can put down, if you're not already familiar with them, of course, you can put down some of these terms, and we can pursue this together in the future, because I'm in Cambridge. So we have the Umur al-Amma, which is the transcendentals, the building blocks of metaphysics. Al-Wujud, existence. Al-Mahiyya, quiddity. Al-Ta'ayyun, individuation. Al-Wahda wal-Kathra, unity, multiplicity. Al-Wujub wal-Imkan, necessity and possibility. Al-Aliyya, causality. Now this is actually very simple. Any existent thing in the world must have all of these things applied to it. There's no way out of it. There's nothing that you can conceive of, whether it's a sky or a tree or an angel, which doesn't exist, according to tautology, but doesn't have a nature, isn't individuated, isn't an individual. It's not just an angel in general. It's Mikael, for example. Doesn't have a share in Wahda and Kathra, and doesn't have a share in Wujub and Imkan, and doesn't have some sort of relationship to different forms of causality. And what the Umur Amma sections, which take up the first 1,000 pages of this developed understanding of the sciences, is they systematically go into the essence of what are all of those things. Now, once you determine what all of those things are, they will then apply necessarily, transitively, to everything else that they will be in the background with everything else that you then subsequently go on to study in the special sciences, whether it's physics or anything else. So, we're drawing to the end here. I can't remember when I'm supposed to start. What time am I supposed to start? Okay. So, it's a bit of a sudden shift here, but I want to draw our attention to the fact that in Islam, the purpose of the sciences is to know God by being the perfect man, insofar as we're able. It's very unambiguous. It follows from our definition of human nature, and there's no getting out of it. We're not studying empirical science so that we can make exciting practical contrivances. We simply weren't. It was never an interest, and it did exist in the context of the civilization, never on its own. That would have been considered complete insanity. So we have this wonderful statement from this great Ottoman exegete of the Quran: قد اتفق أهل الظاهر والشهود على أن الله تعالى خلق جميع الأشياء من نور محمد. So we have an extraordinary thing here. There's consensus amongst the people of the outward and the inward, not like today when there's no consensus whatsoever, and especially on this point, very much in England to this day, this is a bone of contention. Well, it wasn't over the last 600 years very much at all. قد اتفق أهل الظاهر والشهود على أن الله تعالى خلق جميع الأشياء من نور محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. And we have this understanding because reaching the pinnacle in the sciences, if they're understood as embracing all of the sources of knowledge, including the rational and the mystical, involves a transcendence not just from the so mirroring the Prophet ﷺ by following his sunnah. As that becomes more perfect, the knowledge of his inward reality must also become more perfect. And in this understanding, which was not esoteric, was not heretical, was not unusual, and was certainly not an identification of God with his creation, we have the Haqiq al-Muhammadiyya with very strong proof text and very, very early hadith, the perfect, and the aqwal of the Salaf as well, the perfect image of God's names and attributes and the principle of God's knowledge, of which all the other creational essences are branches. And the way to achieve this was again with another framework, which, if we want to commit a genetic fallacy, we can say it comes from Greece and so on. But the truth is, this was discovered. We have an understanding of knowledge as corresponding to objective reality. We have an understanding of all those four sources of knowledge being effusions from the knowledge of God. So there's no problem of the subject and the object and so on. Plato discovered this truth. It's not that the Greeks invented it. Plato discovered this truth, and later commentators discovered these truths in the Quran as well, which is that human nature, our ethical nature, is to be a composite of desire, of anger, and of intellect. And right action must presuppose the subordinateness of anger and desire to intellect. And at the same time, whenever an action involves the subordination of anger and desire to intellect, the resultant trait will be in the golden mean, which is, so for example, the golden mean between wastefulness and miserliness is generosity. The golden mean between recklessness and cowardice is courage. Exactly. So this was absolutely standard, as we'll see from this final. I know I've crammed in so much here, and I do apologise for not knowing better how to give a presentation. Probably only have to present as few things as possible, but these are my limitations. So look at how this Greek bad distinction was integrated into the most orthodox work of tafsir in the whole of our tradition. Baydawi's tafsir, commentating on, "Behold, your Lord said to the angels, I will create a vicegerent on earth." Famous verses. They said, "Will you place therein one who will make mischief therein and shed blood, while we do celebrate your praises and glorify your holy name?" He said, "I know what you know not." It's as if the angels knew that the one made custodian, the one made the Khalifa of the world, the custodian, vicegerent, that terribly abused word, sadly, possesses three faculties that are each pivotal to his life situation: those of desire and anger, which can lead to corruption, the shedding of blood, and the intellectual faculty, which calls him to knowledge and obedience. The angels looked at each of these faculties one by one and said, "What is the wisdom in making him the custodian? We, the angels, already exemplify all the good that can be anticipated from the intellectual faculty, yet we are free from the antagonism towards it threatened by these two other faculties of desire and anger." The angels did not know that the compound of these faculties yields a benefit that the individual faculties taken on their own fall short of, such as the ability to encompass all things and worlds, the origination of arts and sciences, and the drawing out of the positive characteristics of all existence. This is the purpose of knowledge in Islam. The drawing out of the positive characteristics of all existent things from potentiality to actuality, which is the purpose of the appointment of the custodian of the world. And to close, this is the great moment of the secret of the intelligibility of existence being transferred to man, is Adam being taught all of the names, which are many interpretations mean all of the divine names, but also all of the natures of things. And of course that's the continuation of that verse. So man is the custodian because he's the meeting place between the angelic and the animal, and because of the composite nature of his faculties, the mystical, the revelatory, the rational, and the sensible, is alone able to encompass all worlds and things. And we see this coming together of contradictory attributes in the person of the Prophet, manifesting this balance of attributes through his life in the world. The Prophet ﷺ was the perfected balance of all human types: prophet, mystic, husband, father, warrior, ruler, bringing again together all of the attributes in the temporal unfolding. Man's entitlement to the custodianship is due to the perfect receptivity of his nature to opposite attributes, such that he is able to be a locus of manifestation, madhar, of the opposite divine names, again, and accomplish the habitation, cultivation, and construction of both the outward and spiritual worlds. And this is an Akbarian ontology that we won't go into. And the final cause or purpose of all the sciences is to achieve human perfection, the istikmal al-nafs, which ultimately constitutes union with the Muhammadan reality. Very alien to our ears, perhaps, but utterly standard in our later world, which is an extraordinary thing to try to absorb, but it's really true. And very briefly, because this is kind of necessarily disjointed. Why did it all fall apart? Well, I've never found a statement of why as clear as this. Alongside the degeneration of the Ottoman Empire, continued the degeneration in the face of modern empirical science, of the old science, that had for long centuries taken charge of the argument defending the creed of Islam. Now, this degeneration stemmed not from any deficiency in the old science itself, as will become clear to readers of this book, but as a result of the perspectives of a group of individuals who fawned upon modern science in order to curry favour with the nations that had won victory by means of the weapons that they had derived from that science. It was thus that they mistook martial victory for intellectual victory. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
Hasan, thank you so much for this presentation. We don't have much time, so I'm going to immediately open to questions from the audience. I have a few that I can add, but I think since we're so short, the priority is to hear from all of you. So please raise your hands, and if you can, please try to keep the question as brief as possible. Would you like to take a couple at a time and then answer them in a group?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's take 2 or 3 in order to get as many as possible, inshallah.
And thanks for the talk. That was it was very interesting perspective. And I have to start with an apology if I misunderstood any part of that presentation. But so I'm studying science, especially biological sciences, and I think the perspective that you mentioned about the subordination of sciences within this framework is very interesting. But I was wondering, in terms of questions that scientists ask, it can either be of a nature where you're trying to extend knowledge beyond that offered by the scripture. And that can clearly be a way to know God and God's creation. But what about scientific questions in which you're trying to perhaps answer it in a way which provides an alternative to what already mentioned in the scripture? And specifically, I'm talking about scientists studying origin of life.
There's an echo in the voice, so I can't quite make up. No, turn off.
Should I just be loud?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
is that fine? It's not for recording or something.
Yeah, so my question is basically, in terms of scientific questions, you can either have questions in which you're extending the knowledge that you gain from scripture, for example, about the material world and God's creation. So you can see that as a way to go to get to know God better and God's creation better. But what about questions in which scripture does have an answer? For example, the origin of life or the origin of humankind. And when scientists tend to ask that question, how can they still make sure that they're...
You say scripture does have an answer or doesn't have an answer?
It does, like for example, the origin of humans. So if scripture does say something about it, and then when scientists ask the same question, how can they make sure that they're still subordinate within that framework?
So just to repeat the question for the video and anyone who didn't hear, how should scientists approach questions which might directly, in the modern approach of science, might directly contradict something that comes from revelation? And is there anything? Yeah.
In terms of the formation period, I'd be interested to hear if any of the scholars at the time caused the rise of the Ashari school and the downfall of the Maturidi and the Mutazilite school.
Sorry, say it again?
See, in terms of the Ashari school.
No, yeah. I understood the first part.
Any of the scholars at the time caused the rise of that and the downfall of the other 2 schools, so the Maturidi and the...
Well, they didn't call the downfall of Maturidi school.
Well, there was less people coming in Mutazilite school.
Yeah.
Less people were going to...
So who are the thinkers who carried that out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that for now? One more.
I was wondering how you think that our understanding of knowledge and this kind of structural metaphysics and nuance of it, how should that inform our day-to-day kind of behaviors, Islamic behaviors, and just how we see it?
Yeah.
So, just sorry to repeat the question for the video. How should the metaphysics that we've been presented with here inform our day-to-day experience as students and how we go through the modern world?
Brilliant. Thanks. So, in answer to the first question, which I think is about how the modern biologist, for example, can be guided by the revelation. And the truth is, I think we have to be very courageous in a way and rid ourselves of this constant need to kind of relate what we're doing here at Cambridge to kind of Islamize it in some way. You know, I want us all to do very, very well at Cambridge, but let's try and study within the framework that they're providing for us, because there's actually very little crossover. If we were in Cambridge in the 14th century, that would be wonderful, because there's so much crossover, it's almost exactly the same thing. Just a few things, important things that need to be tweaked. But there's so little crossover. The way that the modern biologist looks at the world is it's so bizarre to the traditional Muslim mind. And there's no metaphysical structure that's clear, so you can't really engage with it. The modern scientist doesn't believe in essences, typically. He doesn't believe that species are real things. They're aggregates, they're composites. It's always in this framework of kind of nominalism about essences. You know, these random, chaotic, blind forces come together and then, ooh, you know, a world pops into existence. You know, you have a kind of idea of there are all sorts of metaphysical suppositions contained in the worldview which is grounding most contemporary scientific activity in the natural sciences, but they're metaphysical presumptions which are not examined because we've lost that idea of the relationality of the sciences. So, for example, the assumption that distinct natures can come out of accidental modifications of a thing is just an assumption which, from a metaphysical point of view, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And there's no empirical evidence for it at all. I mean, there couldn't be any empirical evidence for it. It's a metaphysical question. So what I would suggest is that we don't try to do a synthesis between the modern university and our tradition until we know the modern university very, very well, and we know our own tradition very, very well. And then we can start thinking about it. But at this point, it's important to understand what we're doing in the university, but to remain within the framework, because otherwise we're mixing things together in a manner which is not justified and actually will only lead to failure in every possible way. So I think the first clear thing which is necessary is to understand our tradition, become deeply rooted in our tradition. And then, if you understand the unfolding of Islamic intellectual history and the unfolding of Western, all the assumptions that, of the scientific revolution, the rejection of the realist medieval scholastic synthesis, you know, that crossover was not a closely recent crossover. It wasn't that, you know, scientific consensus came together and all kind of laughed up their sleeves at the medievals, how silly of them to not have realized. The truth is, the medieval metaphysical outlook, the structure was far more sophisticated and powerful than that of the main proponents of the scientific revolution, whether it's Descartes or Bacon or Galileo. They're honestly little children compared to the medieval scholastics. But it's a shift, an ideological shift, away from a realist, essences-based metaphysics to an obsession with empirical science and the manipulation of nature, the manifestation of empirical knowledge that is collected in practical contrivances. That's the fundamental thing that's going on. Second question. Do you want to do the second question, or should I just?
No, if you'd like to continue.
No. So, the second question about the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris, Al-Ash'ari's great contribution, again, there's a very important thing about a kind of neo-Ash'arism which is cropping up in the world today, which is a kind of very flag-bearing Ash'arism. We are now Ash'aris, that's how we define it. And the truth is, when you study the text of the tradition, which are Ash'ari, broadly, I mean, we don't know whether Taftazani was Ash'ari or Maturidi. It doesn't matter. He was within the broad framework, because Imam al-Ash'ari was not coming with a comprehensive philosophy. He came to correct certain serious errors in the faithfulness to scripture of the Mu'tazilis, who, and that's a complex story, but we are Ash'ari on certain key tenets of creed, but if you look at the later Ash'aris in terms of metaphysics, they disagreed with Imam al-Ash'ari on almost everything. That's absolutely fine. And then, what was the final question? Do you?
I already mentioned it, but how do we take these metaphysical realities into our lives?
I think there's the impact of just having a strong sense of the reality of things, how things actually were, has a huge impact on everything. And in terms of some sort of, I don't know, spiritual or personal impact of having this structure of knowledge, that would be something which wouldn't happen very immediately. It would be something which, one would have to have quite a close familiarity with that structure in order to start having a very clear impact on one's thinking or one's writing and so on. But I think just understanding that both in the medieval West and in Islam had a very similar structure, which is a structure which makes an awful lot more sense, I believe, and it sounds like quite a dogmatic statement, but I think demonstrably makes a lot more sense than the modern fragmented system of knowledge where nothing's connected to. And the thing is, it's something which is shared. There's a point in Islamic history where, and Christian history, where we actually meet and we have far, far more in common than we do now. And this is mostly through the works of Avicenna, because the structure of knowledge provided by Avicenna is the whole basis of the model of Aquinas. One of the most important bases. Aquinas has been called a synthesis of Avicenna and Augustine, in fact. And so one thing which is a very positive thing on a kind of personal and social level in terms of being able to really engage with what we're doing here and understanding it and understanding our peers and understanding Western intellectuals is understanding there's a point at which we meet and we're actually almost identical. And I think that can only have a very, very positive impact.
So, unfortunately, there's no time for any more questions. I just want to say, in conclusion, that what Sidi Hasan has presented here, the importance of it really can't be overstated. For those of you who may be studying Islamic history, it's a fundamentally different narrative to the one that we're often taught, which is the decline narrative. But then outside of the field of Islamic history, it is one, as Sidi Hasan was saying, that will change our whole worldview and how we experience the external world and our internal world. So I think the session has raised a lot of very important questions. We will have, inshallah, opportunities later in the day to continue the discussion, to approach Sidi Hasan during the breaks, and then in our final session as well, when we will, inshallah, attempt to bring everything together. But for now, please thank Sidi Hasan for his wonderful presentation.